Are you ready for pain? Are you ready for suffering? If the answer is yes, then you're ready.
By now you've all heard the Supreme Court has ruled the race-conscious aspect of affirmative action to be unconstitutional and illegal. This means that race can no longer be a determining factor during the college admissions process. I have 3 things to say. Affirmative action was never about helping Black and brown students who weren't smart enough to qualify to get into elite universities. Every student needs to have a baseline of qualifications which is relative to each school. Affirmative action is about recognizing that race, class, disability, gender, and other axes of identity impact the life opportunities that we have. And if we want to build a truly equitable country, we have to center folks who have historically been disallowed entry into these institutions of learning. Otherwise, there's no upward mobility for folks on the margins. There's just more of the same. Secondly, when I think about Afro-Asian solidarity, this is a clear example of white supremacy working to destabilize coalitions between our communities. Affirmative action is not discriminating against Asian American folks. A 2019 study from Georgetown University concluded that Asian American enrollment share at the most selective colleges has remained stable over the past decade, and that the reason there is an inflated perception that Asian American people are being denied admission is because Asian American students are more likely to apply to highly selective colleges than Black and brown students. So of course, if you're applying to more selective schools, the likelihood that you'll receive a rejection goes up. Ask me how I know. The fact is, the majority of Asian American people support affirmative action. The frustration and anger over the model minority myth is so valid. And I absolutely believe there have been instances where Asian American students have received discrimination, but it's not because of affirmative action. Striking down affirmative action won't ameliorate the model minority myth. It simply recreates the issue of Black and brown students having even less access to higher education than we already do. You want to talk about inequity in admissions? Let's talk about legacy students and people who gain entree because of large donations. Where's the equity in those selections? Why does this matter to me? Because gaining entrance into Cornell University completely changed the trajectory of my life. And for the record, I was more than qualified to be in that space. I received a summa cum laude degree from Cornell University. I also researched Afro-Asian solidarity and coalition building as a Mellon Mays undergraduate scholar at Cornell and for the entire duration of my master's degree. Affirmative action, however imperfect, is about ensuring that everyone has the same set of life chances. And now those chances just got a little more skewed. A fellow Cornell alum, Toni Morrison, noted that, quote, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being, end quote. And I'll just be damned if this isn't a prime example.
I'm going to explain affirmative action in the only way I know how. Partying!
This is the best club in town. It's Friday night, everyone wants to go here, but you gotta look hot, otherwise no entry. This is Street 1. The people who live here live closest to the club. They put on their best outfits, makeup looks snatched, highest heels. They get to the club on time and the bouncer lets most of them in. This is Street 2. These people live a little further from the club, and they have to cross a river, so their feet get wet. It's gross. They get to the club and the bouncer's like, all of you have smelly feet, but your outfits are nice, so I'll let a few of you in. This is Street 3, the furthest street from the club. Not only do they have to cross this river, but they have to walk up this entire mountain range to get to the club. And on the mountains, it's raining, so their makeup is melting and their outfit is totally messed up. They get to the club and they look totally not as hot as everyone inside. The bouncer's like, no way, you didn't follow the dress code. And they're like, we did everything the other people did. So, affirmative action is not that. It's the club owner telling the bouncer that people who live on Street 3 have a lot of obstacles just to get here, so maybe we should consider that before rejecting them just because of their outfit.
A white person who graduated from Harvard Law School in 2022, and let's talk about why getting rid of affirmative action is bullshit. And I don't mean bullshit from a legal perspective, though it is also bullshit from a legal perspective. Google stare decisis because apparently the majority of the Supreme Court can't do so. I'm just kidding, they know exactly what they're doing. But I mean in terms of the metrics by which we gauge merit for admissions into these institutions in the first place. I got into Harvard after public education, but also as the white daughter of 2 government attorneys. Despite being the child of 2 attorneys, for my final 2 years at the school, I qualified for need-based grant aid, which still took into account a percentage of my parents' income, despite the fact that I was in my late 20s. Less than half of Harvard Law School students get need-based grant aid, and so that means that my familial income was below median. And wealth is, of course, highly correlated with race in the United States, due to systems that within our lifetimes were segregating based off race, explicitly and throughout our lifetimes have continued to work for white people at the expense of people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people in the United States. And so anti-affirmative action people love to pretend that these spots are being taken, but no, the spots are very much still there. They're very much still occupied by people that look like me, come from backgrounds like mine, and on the whole are much wealthier than my background, which is crazy because from a global perspective, my family is incredibly well off. And the way that we continue to quote unquote earn these spots is that if you are rich, it is really fucking easy to do well on a standardized test. People talk all the time about early literacy skills as a predictor of future academic success. In a country that does not provide universal pre-K, that does not provide early childhood education or complimentary childcare or government subsidized childcare in lots and lots of places, it is so much easier to build reading skills as a young child if you are from a wealthy background, if you have college educated parents, that don't have to work, and you have a college educated parent staying at home with you, making sure that you know how to read by the time you're 4 years old, like I did. Do you know how long I've been trying to learn Spanish? It's like 5 years, and I am at like a low intermediate level. If schools like Harvard started admitting people based off of something other than who could read the fastest, because that is, I swear to God, what the LSAT boils down to, and instead they changed to another very reasonable metric, like, oh, we're only going to admit you if you speak multiple languages fluently. Or, oh, we're only going to admit you if you have previously held a service job, because we think that it has taught you empathy. I don't think that that's any inherently more or less reasonable than admitting people based off how they did on the LSAT. And so to pretend that things like standardized test results are impartial metrics, they are perhaps impartial of how many points you got on the test, but to pretend that those tests are testing things that are impartial is crazy. None of this is impartial, it's all systems. And so schools should be able to consider the biggest one, i.e. racism.
My white daughter's first response when she saw the new Little Mermaid trailer was, "Oh, it's so cool that she's not white." Why? Because I've spent years talking to my kids about the importance of representation, about the ways that white supremacy shows up in entertainment, and about how seeing color is an important part of activism and working towards equity and social justice. And I say this not to brag, but to encourage other white parents to have these conversations with your kids. A lot of white parents are afraid to talk about race because they think children don't naturally notice race unless it's taught to them. But in fact, the opposite is true. Children start showing recognition of and preference for certain races as early as 3 months. And by kindergarten, many of them show the same internalized biases as adults. In study after study, white children who are not explicitly taught about race show prejudices that shock their parents. Talk to your kids about race. Often. Ask them questions, role-play scenarios, warn them about others who might be prejudiced, and give them tools to handle those situations.
So the Supreme Court shot down race-conscious admissions at universities. As a student at Yale, the school where 4 of the Supreme Court justices went to, 3 of whom voted in favor of dismantling race-conscious admissions. I thought I'd give my input. The premise of affirmative action lies in placing favor on certain individuals or certain groups. We often hear it being used in relation to race, but there are many other ways that we favor individuals in the college admissions process. Think private tutors, SAT prep courses, feeder schools, legacies, connections, wealth. By having access to any of that, you are more likely and oftentimes more successful at being admitted to a college. So it seems that placing favor on all of those things are okay, but when it comes to simply considering race, that's too much of a launching pad. Being black wasn't enough to get me or anyone else into a school like Yale. If that was the case, then you would see low retention rates at universities, meaning that underqualified students of color entered these institutions and realized they couldn't keep up. But that's not what we're seeing. Students of color are often performing just as well, if not better, than their white counterparts. Out of the 5 Yale students that were named Rhodes Scholars were people of color, 2 of whom were black. All this is to say that the argument of underqualified or undeserving black and brown students being admitted to universities falls flat on its face. The importance of diversity at universities is far more than the front of a brochure or filling some sort of quota. What makes Ivy kids so smart and capable is the community that they're exposed to. The collective experience of international students, students from different backgrounds, different incomes, it all enhances our education. I'm not sure what college applications or essay topics will look like. I'm not even sure what Yale will look like 4 years from now. All I know is that my kids and those of many, many black and brown students across the nation will be legacies. And when that happens, I wonder what our justice system will say about legacy-based admissions.
Just this past Tuesday, the Supreme Court effectively banned affirmative action, also known as race-based admissions, at UNC and Harvard. When I was thinking about how to approach this topic, I was really struggling because I realized for people to realize how harmful getting rid of affirmative action is, they have to have a heart and morals. Because the reality is that you can find hundreds and thousands of statistics online where you can clearly see that the median GPA or test scores of Black and Hispanic students who are admitted into elite universities are lower than their Asian or white counterparts. But if you actually manage to overcome confirmation bias and conduct more research with an unbiased perspective, you would be able to see in the racial breakdown of students attending that same university, there are significantly less Black and Hispanic students at those same elite universities. When I've talked to a lot of my peers that are Asian American about their opinions on affirmative action, they think it's a good thing that we're getting rid of it. And I don't necessarily blame them because I used to think that way as well. I thought it was unfair that I could get higher test scores than someone else, but just because I'm Asian, my chances of getting in were significantly lower than their chances. I grew up in a pretty affluent town that was predominantly white. My school system was known for having a pretty good education system. In my school of roughly about 1,300 students, there were maybe at max 10 Black students in my entire school. Contrastingly, when I was a junior in high school, I was placed into foster care, so I had to move to a school that was pretty socioeconomically disadvantaged, and a majority of my peers were Hispanic or African American. I was the minority as an East Asian. There were other Asian people, like there were some Filipino people, Vietnamese people, but the bottom line was that my new school, although it was a little bit more diverse, I was enrolled in 7 APs at my old high school during my junior year. And because my new public high school was so underfunded, they didn't have 4 of my 7 APs. At my old school, where they gave out Chromebooks like it was nothing, at my new school, they probably had at max like 2 computer carts. And if you needed to use a computer, your only option was pretty much going to the library. And while roughly about 20 to 30 students from my old school would get accepted into UCLA, maybe roughly about 1 to 3 students every single year would get admitted into UCLA from my new school. And why was that? It was simply because people from my old school had a lot more money. Almost every single one of my peers had SAT prep tutoring or college counselors. They could afford private tutors for whatever classes that they were struggling in. And they also had parents that had gone to college, parents that could help them with their college applications and knew what colleges were looking for. When I was applying to college, I had to do all the research myself. There were almost 0 resources at my new school, versus at my old school, we had a designated college counselor. The average white family today holds over $170,000 in net assets, compared to just $17,000 for the average Black family in America. If you're arguing that Black students or Hispanic students are stealing your spot at an elite university, try putting yourself in their shoes for once and thinking about how much harder they had to work on their own to achieve only half of what was handed to you. If you're one of those people that believe, oh, well, they should just work a little bit harder, countless studies have proven the prevalence of racial bias within our society. It is found within our education system. It is found when people are applying for jobs. Teachers, recruiters hold this implicit bias that Black students are not as capable as their white counterparts. White people and Asian people in America, on average, live in more affluent neighborhoods and are wealthier than their Black or Hispanic counterparts. If you do not support affirmative action because you think it's unfair, because students are stealing opportunities away from well-deserving students, you should probably be directing your anger towards athletes, legacies, donors, or children and faculty. One statistic I found online was that over 75% of white ALDCs would have been rejected if they weren't an ALDC. People love to use success stories in America as their martyrs of, see, if you just work hard enough, you can make it too. But how can anyone become a success story if they're not given a chance? Each and every single student, regardless of their race or ethnicity, that gets admitted into any university deserves to be there. And I know how it was like applying to college. I remember thinking that college, whatever college I get into, is the end-all be-all. But that's not the reality. I know plenty of students that have gone to community college or less prestigious state schools that are extremely successful. But if other minorities have to work 10 times harder than us to even get a chance to be able to achieve the American dream, why shouldn't they be given the chance to be able to? Because there's this idea that it's easier for Black students or Hispanic students to get into college, who do you think job recruiters are going to think are more deserving of a certain role if they're comparing a Black student and a white student from the same university? But a Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Princeton, Yale education, hardly anyone can argue with that. Instead of trying to determine what is fair or which student deserves to be in a certain university, try to view it in a more holistic sense. Don't just use GPA or test scores as a means to be able to determine what is fair or who is deserving. View it from a more holistic sense and think about what privileges that you've been extended and what privileges your other peers have been extended. Me as a foster youth, me as someone that is a first-generation student, I view college as a means for survival, as a way for me to create generational wealth, because I don't have the support of my parents. while for others, college is just another prestige point that their parents can parade around. Or not getting into college doesn't mean that you'll be homeless or without the support of your parents.